August 1945. While the world raised glasses and set off fireworks to celebrate the end of the war, hundreds of thousands of Japanese soldiers marched in absolute silence, still disciplined, still resolute, unaware that the true hell was about to begin. These men were not weak or unsuspecting victims, but warriors forged since childhood in a culture of total devotion, educated to serve the emperor with every heartbeat. Soldiers who had crossed suffocating jungles, scorching deserts, and showers of bombs without ever lowering their heads. For them, Japan's surrender did not represent shame or failure, but merely the fulfillment of a final order, the conclusion of a mission carried to the limit of what a human being can endure. What no one dared tell these men, what no officer had the courage to reveal, was that precisely at that moment, when the weapons finally fell silent, when blood stopped flowing across battlefields, a different war was beginning, invisible to the eyes of the world, slow as poison coursing through veins, relentless as the Siberian winter. A war waged not against a visible enemy with bayonets and tanks, but against the cold that penetrates to the bone, against the hunger that corrodes sanity, against the deliberate forgetting of nations that preferred not to look back, and against time that advances indifferent to human suffering. While crowds danced in the streets of New York, London, and Paris, celebrating the newly won peace, the Red Army advanced across the Asian continent with a force that seemed to sweep everything before it, like an avalanche of steel and determination. The Soviet Union, fulfilling strategic agreements forged months earlier in closed rooms where the fate of millions was decided with pens and maps, launched its lightning offensive on Manchuria and territories occupied by Japan, transforming the geopolitical landscape of the East within days. For the Japanese soldiers stationed in those remote regions, men who had spent years guarding posts, building trenches, and waiting for orders that never came, news of the surrender arrived in fragmented form, confused, distorted by rumors and the disorganization that always accompanies the collapse of empires. Some laid down their weapons with tears in their eyes, genuinely believing they would return home within days, that they would reunite with wives, children, and parents in a redeeming embrace that would compensate for all the years of separation. Others didn't even have time to process what was happening before being surrounded by Soviet tanks, their expressions oscillating between confusion, relief, and a growing dread of the unknown. There were no great final battles worthy of record in history books, no epic moments of heroic resistance that journalists could transform into dramatic headlines, just long columns of men being systematically disarmed, counted like cattle, cataloged in bureaucratic lists that reduced their identities to cold numbers. More than 600,000 soldiers passed in the matter of a few days from the venerated status of imperial combatants to prisoners of war, a brutal transformation of identity that many would never be able to fully process. Still, they marched with heads held high, shoulders straight despite accumulated exhaustion, eyes fixed on the uncertain horizon, not because they ignored the devastating nature of the defeat they had suffered, but because they carried something deeper than victory or defeat could touch, something that transcended the results of battles and territorial conquests, the indestructible pride of having resisted until the last second permitted by the sacred duty that had been instilled in them since their first childhood lesson. Many still believed, with a naivety that today seems touching, that capture would be merely a brief bureaucratic formality, a temporary inconvenience before returning to Japan, devastated by atomic bombs, where they could finally gather the pieces of their shattered lives. However, the Soviet plan contemplated neither liberation nor compassion, but pragmatic reconstruction of a wounded empire. The Soviet Union had emerged technically victorious from the war, but profoundly mutilated, with its industrial cities transformed into smoking rubble, its infrastructure destroyed from the foundations, and a desperate and urgent need for labor that could raise again the factories, roads, bridges, and buildings that the German war machine had reduced to dust. Those Japanese soldiers became, in the cold and calculating eyes of the Kremlin, an unexpectedly valuable workforce, silent by cultural nature, disciplined by military training, and completely expendable in the eyes of international political logic. The journey began without pompous speeches, without comforting explanations, without farewells that could soften the growing sense of abandonment. Cargo trains crossed entire continents, transporting men who still wore their imperial uniforms, now dirty with dried mud, torn by barbed wire fences, completely useless against the brutal winter that awaited them like a patient predator on the frozen steppes. Days and nights blurred inside the closed and overcrowded wagons, where the air progressively thinned until breathing became a conscious effort, and hunger set in as a constant companion that gnawed not only at empty stomachs, but also at the morale and sanity of the men. Some died right there before reaching the final destination, their weakened bodies succumbing to malnutrition, to diseases that spread in confinement, or simply to the loss of will to continue. Others survived by mentally repeating, like sacred mantras, the teachings learned since earliest childhood in the militarized schools of Imperial Japan. Endure without complaint, resist without showing weakness, accept suffering as an inevitable part of the warrior's path. It was Bushido reinterpreted in its most perverse and cruel form, no longer applied on the battlefield where death could be quick and even glorious, but in the slow and degrading submission to pure biological survival, stripped of any romanticism or transcendent meaning. When they finally disembarked and first set foot on the frozen soil of Siberia, they understood with frightening clarity that they were not merely temporarily imprisoned, but truly exiled from the world they knew, banished to a parallel dimension where the normal rules of civilization ceased to exist. Siberia stretched before them like a world fundamentally hostile to human life, a white and infinite vastness that seemed to devour any attempt to comprehend its dimensions, where the silence was as oppressive and crushing as the cold that penetrated through any material barrier. The forced labor camps did not possess the brutal spectacle of explicit violence seen in war films. There were no guards sadistically beating prisoners for pure pleasure. There were no elaborate torture chambers or theatrical public executions. Their true brutality was hidden in the relentless routine, in the mechanical repetition that transformed human beings into functional automatons. Waking long before dawn, when the sky was still black and the stars shone with cosmic indifference, working cutting trees, building railways, breaking stones until the muscles simply no longer responded to the brain's commands, receiving a minimal food ration that barely contained enough calories to replace the energy spent, and returning to precarious barracks, knowing with absolute certainty that the next day would be exactly identical, and the next as well, and the following one, in an endless succession that annihilated any hope of change. Many of these men had never seen snow in their lives, raised on temperate islands where winter meant only a few weeks of mild temperatures. Now they lived literally within it, surrounded by mountains of ice that accumulated until covering the barrack windows. Temperatures of 40 degrees below zero transformed any minimal carelessness into certain death sentence. Any metal tool instantly stuck to exposed skin, tearing away layers of flesh when separated. The wind cut the face like thousands of invisible blades sharpened to the molecular level. And yet, against all logic and rational expectation, they continued waking, rising, marching to forced labor. The heroism of these forgotten men was not in grandiose feats that could be sculpted in bronze monuments, was not in decisive attacks that changed the course of historic battles, but in the silent and absolutely extraordinary persistence of continuing to exist day after day. They learned to survive through small acts of shared humanity, dividing the last crumbs of stale bread, even when instinct screamed to guard every calorie, warming each other during endless nights when the cold threatened to freeze the blood in their veins, teaching and repeating old songs from their homeland so they wouldn't completely forget who they were before becoming numbers in Soviet files. Some men, carrying within them an inextinguishable flame of culture and civilization, improvised clandestine schools inside the camps, teaching the younger ones Japanese writing, basic mathematics, fragments of classical poetry they had memorized in youth. Others organized small, silent, and risky rituals in memory of companions who did not resist, burying them as best as possible under hardened snow, whispering forbidden Buddhist prayers, trying to preserve some human dignity in an environment specifically designed to destroy it. It is estimated, through Soviet documents declassified decades later, that tens of thousands died in those remote camps, buried under meters of perpetual snow, absurdly far from home, without marked graves, without appropriate funeral ceremonies, without even a final letter to families who would never know their exact fate. But even in anonymous and brutal death, these men carried with them the intangible dignity of those who did not completely surrender to despair, who kept alive a spark of humanity until the last frozen breath. The years passed with torturous slowness, each season dragging like its own eternity. The war had officially ended. Complex treaties were signed on polished tables by suited diplomats who never felt true cold or hunger. New global tensions arose as the world divided between capitalism and communism, and humanity advanced rapidly toward the so-called Cold War, a new type of conflict waged through proxies and nuclear threats. For the Japanese prisoners abandoned in Siberia, time seemed literally frozen, suspended in a parallel dimension where the calendar lost all meaning. Some spent 5 entire years in captivity, 5 consecutive winters where each day seemed to last a week. Others remained 7 years, witnessing companions go mad or silently give up on living. Some, in an almost incomprehensible cruelty, stayed more than an entire decade, leaving the camps already in their 40s or 50s, having lost all their youth and vigor to slave labor. When they finally began to be released, in a gradual and bureaucratic process that extended for years, there were no nationalist fanfares or emotional ceremonies broadcast by the radio. They were simply placed back on rusty ships and noisy trains, now heading to the home that existed only as a distorted and idealized memory, not knowing if they would still have families waiting or if their houses would still be standing. The return was, for the overwhelming majority of these survivors, as psychologically painful and disorienting as the captivity itself had been. The Japan they found was no longer in any way the militarized and traditional country they had left behind a decade earlier. Entire cities destroyed by conventional and atomic bombs had been completely rebuilt following modernist urban plans inspired by the West, with concrete buildings replacing ancestral temples. Cultural values were changing rapidly under American occupation, with traditional Bushido being gradually replaced by democratic and pacifist ideals that seemed alien to the veterans. Entire families had learned to live without them, rebuilding routines, overcoming premature mourning, and in many cases forming new families after declaring the soldiers officially dead. Some were received with genuine tears of joy and tight embraces that tried to compensate for years of absence, elderly mothers falling to their knees upon recognizing sons they had given up for lost. Others, in a darker and more common reality, were received with embarrassed silence and looks that mixed guilt, confusion, and even resentment for the complication their return represented. There were some who simply didn't believe their stories about Siberia, thinking they were exaggerations of traumatized veterans seeking attention or justifications for years of absence. There were some who actively preferred not to hear, fearing that the horrible narratives would disturb the fragile psychological peace they had built in the post-war period. The suffering experienced in Soviet labor camps did not fit comfortably into the heroic and aestheticized narrative of traditional Japanese warfare, with its honored samurai and glorious deaths, and for this reason was systematically pushed to the forgotten margins of national collective memory, mentioned only in footnotes of history books. Still, carrying invisible scars deeper than any physical wound, these men brought with them a silent and profound victory that few could adequately recognize or name. They had survived not only the conventional war with its bombs and bullets, but the forgotten post-war, the part of history that no one wanted to document or celebrate. They resisted when absolutely everything indicated, according to any rational logic, that they should simply disappear into the frozen oblivion of Siberia. They transformed systematic humiliation into daily resistance, brutal captivity into definitive proof of human character, deliberate forgetting into silent but indestructible legacy. Many never spoke openly about what they experienced, carrying the memories like wounds that never completely healed, but they built families with the love they had saved for years, worked with the same iron discipline that kept them alive in the ice, rebuilt their lives brick by brick with the same unwavering determination that once took them to the battlefield without question. The story of the Japanese soldiers captured after the 1945 surrender is not just another technical account of suffering documented in military archives, but a true human epic about genuine honor in times of crushing defeat, about dignity preserved when everything conspired to destroy it. It is living and incontestable proof that real heroism doesn't end when weapons fall silent and treaties are signed, and that there are infinitely more difficult battles waged far from the spotlights of official history, in places where no reporter arrives, where courage is not measured by medals hung on the chest or military parades, but by the simple and extraordinary capacity to continue living, breathing, existing, when absolutely everything seems lost and meaningless. They were soldiers without a war to fight, prisoners without specific guilt beyond having been born Japanese and served their country, survivors without the immediate recognition they deserved from a nation anxious to forget its defeats, and yet, against all odds calculated by the cold logic of history, they remained standing until the end. When the world celebrates and remembers the end of World War II in documentaries and solemn ceremonies, it remembers primarily precise dates engraved in bronze, treaties signed with expensive pens, bombs that illuminated the sky like artificial suns. But there is another story running parallel, written with frozen blood in the merciless ice of Siberia and in the heavy silence of men who returned home changed forever at the most fundamental level of the soul. A story of contained pride that never turned into parade, of absolutely silent heroism that no official historian wanted to celebrate, of absolute resistance that yielded no monuments or national holidays. Because for these forgotten soldiers, the true war did not end symbolically with the surrender signed on the deck of the USS Missouri, did not end when the Emperor spoke on the radio for the first time in his human and fragile voice. It ended only when they finally managed to return home, set foot again on Japanese soil, and prove against all statistical and logical expectations, against the implicit desire of powers that preferred their convenient disappearance, that the human spirit can survive and even prevail, even when the entire world decides to move forward without looking back even once, without asking what happened to those men who simply disappeared into the frozen mists of the East.